Good. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Okay, I wanted to talk about user experience without user interface. So how do you make a user experience for an action video game? In the past, I've done a lot of game design for these companies. Mostly what we call systems design. So that's stuff like what are the rules of the game, how do you control the game, the artificial intelligence for the game. So not necessarily what it looks like, and not the level design, not the arrangement of the space that the player is going to run through. It's all the systems that are kind of running underneath that. And I think that is quite appropriate for the topic today. As was mentioned, I now do this thing called dxSaigon, or Design Exchange Saigon. Okay, so I think oftentimes when you think about UX for software, you think about the user interface. It's kind of the most obvious thing that you might be pointing to. In video games, normally user interface is called a HUD, or heads-up display. But in action games, even though there is a HUD, we don't look at it very often. Mostly we're looking at the character who's doing the action on the screen, and we're trying to find the enemies or bullets that we have to dodge, right? So we only occasionally look at the UI. But we're still interacting with the game all the time, and we do that through the control interface. And it might be a touch screen, or it could be a gamepad. It might be motion detection, like a PrimeSense Connect, or a machine vision, like a Sony iToy. Okay, so if we're not going to talk about the HUD, if we're not going to talk about the UI, what are we going to talk about? What are the core topics when you want to learn about creating an experience in an action game? I think there's two general categories. One is the things you do to create a feeling, and I really mean like a physical feeling in your body, in the player's body. And then the other thing is more on the intelligibility side of things. Does the game make sense? Is the way that you're interacting with it or controlling with it intuitive? Does it make sense? I'm going to try to go into some of these topics in depth, especially these ones. The reasons why I kind of picked these topics and not the other ones is a lot of the visual communication in a game is on the level design side of things, or it could be within the animation, which is something that a systems designer would be involved with, but it's a bit too, we're just going to barely touch on that. Rhythm, again, is also like when you're doing your movements in the game, when you're putting your inputs to get the different attack sequences to come out, what does the rhythm of those? And I don't think there's a lot we can say about that other than if you've done dancing, or if you've done video editing, or if you've played music, you start to feel that any given situation has an appropriate rhythm to it. And when you're making a game, you want to kind of discover what the rhythm for that game is, and then express it through the animation or the controls. Convention is something that was talked about a little bit in the previous presentation, and it's very important for following it 80% of the time, and then not when the convention's bad, right? But generally, the idea there is like if everybody is putting this piece of the interface in this spot, it's a good place to put it because the user expects to see it there, right? So if you decide to do something different than the convention, you better have a very good reason for that. Okay, so let's get into these bold topics. I'm not going to talk much about touchscreen games during the formal presentation, just traditional console games, which would have a controller like one of these. So other than like the inputs that the player's seeing on the screen, they're interacting with the game not through mouse and keyboard, unless it's a PC game, but they're through one of these things, which they're holding with their hands, right? This is a Nintendo GameCube controller. It's my favorite controller that has ever existed. And you can see it's quite asymmetrical in its layout. And then a PlayStation 2 controller, which is very symmetrical in its layout. A key topic for designing controls for a game is the ergonomics of the controller. And when we say that, what we mean is, how do you comfortably use the controller? Some buttons are harder to touch than others, right? Some are easier to touch. Normally, the easiest button to touch we call the primary action button. So can you guess on the GameCube controller what is the primary action button? Anyone? Just scream it out. This one is. The big, it's actually green, but green like go. But what's the primary action button on the PlayStation controller? Yeah, it's generally considered to be X. So when you're making an action game, you want to put the main activity that the player does over and over again on the primary action button. Normally, if the character can jump, you put jump on the primary action button. Right? Now, you might have some debate on your game specifically, like maybe the primary action is shooting a gun, and maybe jumping is something that you don't do very often, right? But even then, because of convention, because jump is put on X or it's put on A in so many other games, even if jump is kind of a secondary action, you might consider still using that convention. I don't want to talk a lot about the industrial design of controllers, but it's also interesting to note like the symmetry in the two analog sticks on a PlayStation controller versus the asymmetry that's on the Nintendo controller and also on the Xbox controller. They also have a layout kind of like this. I like that asymmetry. I mean, it's somehow more beautiful this way, right? But it obscures the functionality. This one even has a C on it, which stands for camera. And in a lot of action-adventure games, the primary thing you're doing is running around. Sometimes you adjust the camera. And this joystick is smaller than this other one. It's like a worse joystick. But it can afford to be worse because you don't use it that often. You just use it every so often when you have to adjust the camera. But moving your character around all the time is this kind of more prominent button. Okay, the next super important, maybe the most important topic is responsiveness. The most important topic for an action game, but I think it's also very important for websites and apps as well. Mostly what we mean by responsive is how long does it take for there to be a reaction on the screen as a result of me giving an input into the system. So I click on a link, how long until I can see the contents of that next website? Or I swipe in an application and it goes from one screen to the next. How much delay is there before the next screen comes in? And generally, the shorter the amount of time, the better. And as far as kind of just giving a good feeling, that's important in apps. But in an action game, where the difference between even a 60th of a second can mean if you live or die, you really want to have this responsiveness as quick as possible. So to understand a little bit more about what's happening mechanically here, we have this thing called a core action loop or an action loop. First, you have some kind of information happen on the screen. Maybe a bad guy, an enemy, starts to do an attack, right? That information travels from the screen to your eye. It then gets processed in your brain. and you make a decision of which button you want to hit. You make a decision which button you want to hit. That decision goes back to the game console, which processes your button inputs, and then updates the states, renders the states, and then puts that image back onto the television. And then this repeats 60 times a second. But it's not only happening in one direction. There's a feeling when you push down on these game controllers. They have a little bit of a resistance to the buttons, right? And so the moment that you start pushing down, you are also getting a feedback instantly from the controller. And then you'll have things like maybe the character, if they jump higher, you hold the button down longer. So now you start to associate like long or high jumps with this kind of pressure in your finger. And it's not long before the player feels in their body, very physically, what's happening in the screen. Additionally, maybe there's some force feedback, like a rumbling in the controller. So you send an input that you're doing an attack, and then the console will send back a command to the controller that it has to vibrate at a certain frequency or amplitude. And then that information is going back into your brain. And you start to correlate these things. You correlate the feeling of the vibration with what you're seeing on the screen. And you're correlating your inputs with the actions that result in the screen. And the more delay you have, the more out of sync it feels. To the point where if there's too much delay, you feel that your actions are not really affecting the world. And we call that like a sloppy game, I guess, right? But when it gets very close, let's say within a 60th of a second or maybe a 30th of a second, it starts to become very real. There's some things that like you don't have a lot of control over. Like when televisions moved to LCDs, suddenly they had like 30 milliseconds of additional displayed lag. So even though the image was sent from the PlayStation to the televisions were slower than they used to be. And it would take longer to show the new image, right? So you don't have a lot of control over that. Maybe as TVs get faster, that gets taken care of. But as a developer or a designer, you can't really control that part. So where do you have control over? You also don't have control over really how quick a player can react to something in terms of their own innate reaction speed. So you have 2 or 3 other areas where you can control this. One is you can be generous with the tells that the enemies are giving you. That's to say, does the enemy attack suddenly without any warning? Or do they have a kind of like a slow wind up that they're about to do a big attack and then they do the attack? Right? The more of a tell or a anticipation that you give to the player, the more time they're going to have to make a choice of how they want to react to that. Within the controller itself, you have a lot of leeway. A very important, this is going to sound maybe silly, but a very important rule about action game design is on button down. What does that mean? Most controllers, digital switches on controllers, give 2 signals. They give a signal when the button is pressed, which is on button down. And then when the switch becomes deactivated, it sends a message on button up, or a button up message. So if I want to remove some of the lag time within this loop, if it's a punch or a gunshot, I can have it happen on button down and not wait for the player to put the button up. So that's one spot. Another spot within the controller is throw distance and the filtering of that. So let's say you have a joystick and it can move this far, right? But you start getting inputs from it immediately because it's an analog joystick. So let's say you get a value somewhere between 0 and 1 as it goes this way. So this would be 1 and this would be 0. And so you could say, if you said, okay, only start moving when the value gets to 1, there's going to be whatever time it takes to actually move this thumbstick or this joystick all the way over before the character even gets the command that he should start moving, right? But you use some kind of intelligent filtering on that. So you say, okay, anything from 0 to 0.1, we're going to ignore because it might be just a bad calibration or it might be an accident. But we might start walking from 0.1, and then maybe we'll start running from 0.5. And then anything more than 0.5 doesn't matter. And then, okay, within this part, you can have efficient code and maybe efficient design patterns. And then lastly, the animations themselves, like how many frames does it take before a character starts running or before they start doing the attack? The shorter the amount of frames, the more kind of responsive it's going to feel. And animators will hate designers for telling them to shave off frames of animation from the beginning because it kind of is against their training about making fluid animations with nice anticipation. But as far as the character that the players are controlling, you actually want that. You want bad animations, bad in a classical sense, but good in a game sense. And then the last general topic is making things intuitive. How can you help with the decision-making process? And in an action game, that's going to be stuff like clearly communicating danger, right? If something that looks like lava is safe and something that looks like grass is dangerous, it's not going to be intuitive for a player, right? It's not related to their common sense of how the world works. So also accurately communicating space. If you're doing a jumping game like Mario, and some jumps are very hard to make, it's very important that you have accurate measurements for jump distances. Because you want, at the beginning, the player is going to fail, but eventually they're going to learn. And you want that learning they do to be transferable throughout the whole play experience. It's a bunch of level design stuff you could do, like let's say there's a split in the path and one way is the right way to go, and maybe you could make something shiny over there or use the lighting or the colors to kind of make the player feel they should go that way. Again, building on convention. There's a game I really loved, but I hated the controls. It was called Shadow of the Colossus. And he put jump on Y, on the Y button. I'll show you that one. He put jump on this button, whereas this is the convention, right? So every time you went to jump, you would like do something that wasn't jump, and it was very confusing. His reasoning was he wanted players to feel very uneasy whenever they jumped, right? But normally the theory is, normally the theory is that like it's unfortunate we have to use these controllers, so we should make them as transparent as possible, right? We want the experience to be about your mind and the game, and not about these cumbersome things in between. Yeah, a lot of it's about using common sense. And then I don't have a slide for this, but I think it's important to mention. How do you learn what is intuitive in design? There's some science in design, right? But a lot of it is intuition. And you develop that intuition just through experiencing things over and over again, right? And it's helpful if you experience them with a very analytical or critical mind. So the next time you're using an app and it feels good, don't just say, oh, it felt good, it must have been a good app. You have to try to deconstruct it. Figure out what was it that was making it feel good. I played action games for years and years and years using this kind of analytical mind as I was playing them. This game is better than that game, but why? You know, what are they doing about the animations? Exactly in what way is the camera interacting with the stick versus the relative motion of the character on the screen? And just by kind of breaking down these very complex experiences into their pieces, and then trying to figure out how are those pieces interacting with each other and how are they constructed. You start to build a vocabulary within your subconscious where you can know, oh, this works normally, let's try it and see if it works in our case also. Okay, so yeah, these were the kind of the high-level topics that I thought were important, and a little question to ask along with each one. So ergonomics, is this easy to touch? I mean, the most basic sense, is it easy to use this control? Responsiveness, can I make it react faster to my inputs in any way? Rhythm, is it too fast? Is it too slow? If you're using like a tweening algorithm, are you using the right kind of ease in and ease out? Would a different one feel better? Convention, like what did Facebook do on their app? What did Airbnb do on their app? It might not be the right solution for you, but it might be a good place to start. The intuitive usability, like mapping reality. Another example of that I wanted to give. In a lot of shooting games, especially first-person shooters, they put the shooting, which is really the primary action, they don't put it on X or on the big A button. They put it on one of the shoulder triggers. And you could say, well, that's a harder button to use in many ways, so why are they doing that? But of course, in the real world, guns have triggers that you use with your index finger. So there's some kind of like concrete mapping of the real world to the virtual world that kind of makes it make sense. And then, yeah, visual communication. Are your options obvious to the user? So that's it. So I think the rhythm in Flappy Bird's probably not good, but that's why people like it. Right? Like, it's a very, very difficult game. So people play it purely for the overcoming something difficult aspect of it, right?
In terms of the gameplay, it's very simple. I mean, it's tap on the
So
screen.
easy to understand. It's very intuitive, right? I think if you said, in the way that I am interfacing with it, did they do a good job? And the answer is yes, because it's a very simple interaction, a simple way of controlling it, right? In the context of a game, if you have to show some information in an interface, it's in some way like you failed to communicate in some other way that was more clever, because it's like the easiest way to communicate to them. It's just like in filmmaking how exposition is considered lazy storytelling, because if you just have somebody narrate, this is what the story's about, it's less sophisticated than showing what the story's about through the action that's happening within the movie, right? But if you're making a website or an app, it's almost all UI, right? But I think a good example would be something like Tinder, where you have very little HUD going on. I mean, you're mostly interacting with the system through gestures, right? And like the amount of HUD's the amount of user interface is quite minimal. If you looked at something else, maybe like, I'm just guessing here, but maybe like the LinkedIn application, there's probably going to be way more menus and buttons and stuff. Yeah. So this is just like, this I thought sounded catchy. Right? It sounds like a catchy topic, but and I wanted to show that you can make a user experience without thinking necessarily about the user interface of the product, just by thinking of the other ways of interacting with it. But in the real world, even the most accomplished action games do have HUDs. They do have interfaces, especially when you talk about like the menus or the inventories and these things. So it's just that their importance is downplayed through most of the game action. And when it's important, if you look at, let's say, a game like Street Fighter 4, where you have a health bar, and knowing how much health you have left is important. And you have super meters, and knowing how full a super meter is important. But none of that's as important as not getting punched by the opponent, right? So they'll do something like, when this meter becomes full, now it catches on fire, and there's flames shooting out of this meter. Or when this meter becomes close to empty, its color changes from green to red. So that's kind of an example of, OK, the HUD's there, and when it's important to see it, we're going to call attention to it. But when it's not important to see it, we're not going to show it much. For like a big commercial title, an insane amount of user research. Yeah, like
photo usability testing.
Yeah, and things like having video cameras recording people's faces, because if they fill out a questionnaire later about what they liked of the experience, they might not be exactly honest. But if you compare footage of their face side by side with their playing, you can see, oh, that's a frustrated visual expression. Like, what's happening in the game world at that moment that's making them frustrated? And is that a good kind of frustration or a bad kind of frustration? Because in an app, most frustration is going to be considered bad. But in a game, it might be good. I mean, Flappy Bird is very frustrating, but it works for it, right? Because it kind of sets up something that you're later going to overcome. It's just a temporary frustration that will later give way to some kind of euphoria when you master that skill. So.